So welcome. So we get to have a conversation for the next 20 minutes on the role and place of both religious practice and spiritual practice, and how this is evolving in our current time. What are the innovations, and how do we find our own particular path, whether that's through a traditional faith-based approach or through a spiritual but not religious approach. I'm really glad to have both of you to explore that. So I guess the first question is, what do you both see happening in this landscape? If we said that there's a, quote, the spiritual landscape, I think is one phrase that people have used, and you can either come that through the religious doorway or through kind of a different doorway. But what do you see happening in your work? What are people interested? What are they hungry for? Where are we going? Do you want to start, and we can pass it over to
Sure. So I admit that even though I started a company rooted in religious tradition and culture, I didn't actually know how to define spirituality. And I was lucky enough to have a Catholic nun in her 80s named Big Sue, self-titled, help me work through that kind of halfway through this past year as I was building ARC. So for me, it feels important to even say, what is spirituality when we're talking about the spiritual landscape? And to me, it is trying to figure out who you are and how you want to be in the world. And that necessarily brings you into contact with other people. How do I want to be treated? How do I want to treat other people? And also, it's about encountering mystery. So acknowledging that there are questions we don't know how to answer and grappling with that. So that said, if that's spirituality, then religion is one map to getting there, to answering those big questions. And I think we just see a really increasingly mainstream conversation and need around tools and maps for figuring out who we are and how we want to be in the world.
And do you see any particular trends, at least in your community? Are people more interested in religion, less interested in religion? Are they wanting more social community? Are they wanting more contemplative time? Or are they still figuring it out? Is there something you're...
I think specifically in the Jewish community, there's also a question of identity. So you can say, I'm Jewish. I can say, I'm Jewish, and I meditate, and I like singing circles, and when I'm biking in the mountains, I feel pretty spiritual. And I think what I'm seeing in my own community is people really feeling super proud of that identity and that history and that culture of being Jewish. And there's a gap between that really strong pride and identity and sense of self tied up in Judaism and an active way to live Jewishly that feels integrated into their lives and relevant and inclusive and it doesn't require them to step out, go do something Jewish, and then come back to who they are in their daily life.
Right. Okay. Have that.
In some of my circles, I like to start by asking permission from my elders. So, any elders in the crowd, Papa Perkins, may I begin? Thank you. Well, when I think about that question, I'm reminded of Martin Luther and what he was doing with his proclamations. When Martin Luther was proclaiming against this centralized entity that purported to be the arbiter of this relationship to a God out there and used dogmatic practices to determine that flow, I see us. I see us wanting a more intimate and personal, deeply spiritual connection. I see us disavowing the dogma that has been that. And I see us kind of stepping away from that arbitration of a centralized entity towards a far more decentralized way of touching what is real right here, right now, all the time.
Yeah. And where is the place, because I think there is a movement, or some people feel by calling yourself Jewish or Buddhist or whatever, you're dividing yourself. You're already creating a sense of you're this and I'm a that. But there's also real power in those communities and in those traditions. How do you feel like we navigate that? Do we just kind of have multiple experiences? In some situations, we are that particular faith, and in other situations, we're just human. How do you see us navigating that, either one of you?
It's so funny that the ties that bind also separate at times. And the way that we play with it, my partner and I go back and forth with Fanon. And Fanon talks about sinking into this beingness, and he puts on these narratives of who he is. I'm a black man, and that means this, and it fades away. And so, at least what we see in Fanon, which is what I see some folks trying to live out, is they're trying to touch into a non-being or a being through spirit and play with the different narratives, okay? Try and make them more supple, such that they're not so rigid, so that we can drop into a tradition, respect it, truly honor it, realize that that's one path among many up a mountain, but then drop out into being and create this back and forth dialectic.
It's beautiful, beautiful. Danya, do you want to speak to that at all in your community?
Yeah, I mean, I think beyond religion and spirituality today, so much about identity is fluid. So if we look at gender, sexuality, nationality, race, like so few of our kind of classic paradigms of the self are singular or even binary. And I think it would be naive to think that religion is going to be any different now or in the future. And so, you know, Judaism is a funny one because it's an ethnicity, it's a religion, it's a culture, so it's kind of got its own use case in terms of answering that question. But I think the way that I would answer, like, what do we do about this, you know, kind of labeling or kind of specific, like, singular sense of belonging to a religion or a practice or a tradition, we let that go. And we just,
because it seems that there's this power in this identity, and it motivates people to do all kinds of things. And if you look at the election, you know, presidential candidates are always trying to get the faith-based community to be like, I'm on your side, like, and often uses languaging like, oh, that other person's going to try and take something away from you. So there's that place of like, oh yeah, we're the Christians, we're going to vote for this, or we're the non-Christians, we're going to vote for that. And it doesn't seem to bring us together. And I'm wondering what your visions are. And maybe you already spoke to it a little bit, but what is a vision that we can have moving forward that honors that, but that also is motivated by a different place? And I think, not to go too much on, but if you look at the last election, at least in the US, there's a kind of leadership that's being embodied that is different than we've seen. And how do we all kind of come together, no matter our denomination or faith or non-faith, to help inspire a different kind of leadership? So that's what's on my mind. But I know that we can't just be like, oh, all these identities are nothing. Now we're all just one. It doesn't seem to help.
Yeah.
I'm glad you brought that up. Right down the street, Howard Thurman's church, Church for the Fellowship of All Peoples, designed by Reynold Niebuhr's dad, is down there. And Thurman, laying that mystical foundation for the modern civil rights movement, very much articulates this vision of going deep down into ourselves such that we come up in everyone else. And if that is the lens from which we attempt to be in community and attempt to live the body politic, that is one that respects the differences and cherishes them and sees them as the ways when we hold them together and create tension that we can come to some type of divine. But it also encapsulates that in that sacred unity of oneness there.
Yeah.
And so Thurman, through King and Harding, kind of gives us a great model if we really know what to look at. You know, not just any surface legislative victory, but really what they were doing on the soul and psyche of this country.
Yeah.
They give us a good model.
Yeah. And how do you see that? How do you see that moving forward? Do you see it moving forward currently in our culture today? Do you see the seeds of people coming together around that approach, or what do you see as you look out at your world and communicate with the people that come to find you? Are you hopeful? Are you scared? Are you like, yeah, we're doing this? Are you like, oh man, we're in deep shit here?
Yeah, I see a lot of hungry folks.
Yeah.
A lot of people thirsty and wanting something. They kind of know what they want, but just because people have stepped out of the container and structure of religion don't mean they ain't got that deep hunger of the spirit.
Yeah.
And so I see a lot of people with that hunger and wanting that to be nourished. Yeah. And we're latching out in a bunch of different ways, in a bunch of ad hoc ways. And I think our job right now, as responsible stewards of the spirit, is to help recognize those things for what they are, is that legitimate holy longing, and help folks name that, build structure around that, recreate structure around that, support that. And I think from that place, we may begin to have a stronger foundation to live out in a more loving world.
Yeah, beautiful. How about you?
Yeah, the first thing that comes to mind for me is just a personal story and experience. I was at a retreat full of people innovating and creating around purpose and meaning, and some more faith-based, others soul cycle. And there were some morning practice options, and one of them was yoga, and one of them was Muslim prayer, and one of them was something else. So, like, obviously I was going to go to yoga because that's what I know how to do. And then it occurred to me this was an opportunity to do the thing that was the most intimidating and that felt like the least obvious thing to do. So I went to the Muslim prayer. I was being led by a woman, which was also and is still pretty radical. And, you know, I was taught growing up, like, you don't bow to someone else's God, although that might be the same God, you know. And so it just felt like physically scary to go there and to kneel down on the ground and to say these words in a language I didn't understand. And is this wrong? And
am I going to get in trouble for this?
yeah, like, what's going to happen? And I just, of course, just did it and cried the whole time because it was so beautiful, not only to see her actually going through her own experience of breaking rules and being a little radical within her own tradition, but also just to realize, like, when you pray someone else's prayers, you don't even have to know the words to realize you're praying for the same things. And it's not the things that feel yucky. Like, we're all just praying for our families to be well and for us to succeed or get wherever we're trying to go and to be safe. And so I think, you know, our unique, innate human capacity is to be in community with other people. And as the world gets flatter and as we have more microphones, there are just more others. But when we pray someone else's prayer, literally or figuratively, we realize we're way more alike than we are different.
And what do you see, that's beautiful, and what do you see in the next generation coming up? Both of you, do you have a sense of where they're going to take us? Because it does seem that there is that we're all one, and I also think they look to social media for community in a different way. But there also seems to be a real hunger for spirituality that just because of the kind of immersive lifestyle that we all live now, I think a lot of people feel really challenged by, and there's a lot of loneliness and crazy stuff we see happening where people just have this great sense of loneliness. And traditionally, there has been the religious kind of structures have provided some sense of that, you know, skillfully or not skillfully, of a sense of belonging. I'm wondering how we can move forward to encourage that sense of belonging so people don't have to do the things that we see happening. So any thoughts on that? I appreciate it. We just have a few minutes left. So
Yeah. I have like a whole list. I don't even know where to start. Like, that's the good news, you know? yeah, I mean, I think there's stuff that's a little bit less explicitly spiritual or religious. I just read an awesome article and analysis on a cycling club called Rafa. I don't know if anyone's a fan out there, but they've created these local hubs for cyclists to commune, and it's just deeply and quickly grown, and they have clothing and like all these ways for people to identify each other, but to also have these experiences together. So there's, there's fitness stuff where you're doing things physically with other people and rooting for each other as a team.
And did you feel like that has the same spiritual oomph that?
I think like that in particular, there's totally this sense of like
Yeah.
wonder and exploration that we also can get from a more traditional, religious or spiritual setting, and a sense of like, I got your back. Like when you cycle, you draft, like you literally bike so close to each other that your wind pulls someone else along.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of real stuff there, but I guess like one more obvious thing that comes to mind, man, there's so much. I mean, the big quiet maybe is something that this crowd is familiar with that I love. It's mass group meditations, and they've just started musical events for group singing, and I mean, people cry and hug and touch, and
Yeah. DJ, any final thoughts about where we're going and what the next generation needs and how to support them?
Absolutely. As a continuation of that, you see the centralized services that the church once provided, and fellowship, meaning-making, transcendence, narrative, dating, basic social services, all being decentralized, and we're in that process. So you've got, I just listen to my podcast for my preaching, and I go to my spins group for my transcendence or a concert, and I don't get social service from the church anymore. I do something else. So they're being decentralized, and I think in this stage, from here, what we do is we kind of deepen a little bit more. This very much feels like a deepening of the decentralization process. Perhaps there may be a place for us to kind of reorient those in more centralized entities. I doubt it. But certainly I think these groups, whether it's the Big Quiet and Jesse and them or others, they themselves, as leaning into their spiritual formation, they are developing. And as they develop and start to see what they're doing as really the evolution of Martin Luther's legacy, the communities will deepen. We will deepen together with one another. And so I very much feel like that's kind of where we're going. Our job is to provide support for that, name the power that is there, and kind of pray to God that we can get it done.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you both for the time. Our time is up. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.